So how do I see the world as a Christian who is also a scientist? My starting point is that the best explanation for the reality of the world is that God is, and that God did create the heavens and the earth. And God is the best explanation for why anything exists at all, why there is something as opposed to nothing, and why what does exist, the heavens and the earth, are perfectly supportive of exactly the kind of life that we are. And that life is broken by sin and by judgment, and it is on a pathway of decay and death. And if we're honest about ourselves, that's exactly what we see in the world around us. Now, I compare that to what I would say is an irrational view, that everything came from nothing for no particular reason, and that it became something that eventually became everything, and that everything is in a state of constant improvement to the point that those things became living, those living things became multicellular and very, very complicated, and that those things then became conscious, those living things became conscious, and then developed rational thought. So from nothing or from irrationality or non-rationality came everything that is and everything that is rational and understandable. And I see this as an irrational view of the world, that everything is improving and getting better by comparison to the reality of what we see in the world. So how do I see the world? Well, I do see the world as being broken. I see the world as having started out in a condition that it doesn't enjoy anymore, a condition of perfection, a condition of purity that has been corrupted through time, through the advent of accumulation of mutations, removal of God's hand of support, care through the brokenness of the relationship because of sin. And I think that is also reflected in the idea that the world itself has gone through tremendous amount of change. Whether you think that there was a supercontinent called Pangaea or another kind of a supercontinent, there is evidence that the world itself went through a tremendous geologic upheaval, and that original continent has separated into the different continents that we see today, and that the world itself is broken in a sense that it used to be a unified single continent, and now it is broken and fragmented. We talk about nature very often as being natural, but there is a secret, really, to nature from the Christian worldview, and the secret is that that isn't true, that actually nature isn't natural, that it is, in fact, broken. We think of it as beauty and color and organization, and we think of it as what we enjoy when we're not working. And we often don't think of how it supports the way we live. But the reality is that we live in a broken world, just like people in this photograph were living after World War II in a broken city. A city that partially works and partially doesn't work. A city that looks nothing like what it was intended to look like because of the devastation and destruction of the war. And we see as Christians that the devastation and the destruction is the war of sin. It's the war against God through sin. And that has created the destruction in the world, which we look at in terms of micro events of mutation and genetic load and deformities and sickness and death. But we still live in a world, but it's not natural. It does support us, but it's not the way it used to be. One of the major problems with the world as we encounter it today is that we can't see or hear a God who is there. And that's a problem. The reason for that is that we were the ones who broke the relationships. We were the one who stepped away from God, who disobeyed. We were the ones who pulled down the shade. And after a while, God ceased to speak to us in the same way. And that God is there, and we can see the evidence of His design around us, just like we can see the FedEx arrow. But the world itself isn't perfect, and it shows evidence of major brokenness. We have wars all around the world. We have people who live in fear. We have people who are angry at each other. We have selfishness. We have a lack of empathy for other people. And this has been the testimony of mankind through the centuries. We have people who are deceitful, who spend time trying to game the system. There are many people who spend time thinking about how to steal from others, how to murder them and then steal from them, because they have no respect for the life that God created. We live in a time and a society where right has become wrong. Indeed, if you even believe that there is a standard of right and wrong. The Christian does, because there is a God who has determined a standard of right and wrong. But we live in a world where people are broken, and they live through broken relationships and broken families and horribly broken lives. And the reason for that is our own sinfulness, and we are reaping the consequences of that. There's constant disease, and there's famine and suffering around the world, and yes, there's death. Death may, in fact, be an invader in this world. Death may not have been God's intent for us to endure, but one that we are now enduring because of the consequences of sin. And after the accumulation of genetic mutations and disease and famine, we end up having much shorter lifespans than we otherwise would. And those lifespans, I think, could have lasted as much as 1,000 years. And not necessarily having death at the end, but translation into God's presence. And certainly, all around the world, in every place, there is moral confusion. In the beginning of life, when does life begin? In the middle of life, how is life lived? And at the end of life, how can we take life from people who we think are suffering? How can we take the prerogatives of God into our own hands? There is moral confusion. Many people see the history of human life as one which began with humans being hunters and gatherers and eventually developing agriculture. Christian says, yes, we may have been hunters and gatherers because we were expelled from the garden, because we sinned against God. And now animals had the fear of humans in them, and humans were afraid of animals. And suddenly the ground no longer produced the same food that it would normally give us. And so we end up having to scratch a life, literally scratch the ground, to plant seeds, to grow crops, to be able to live. Nothing like the way we were intended to live. But that is in fact the consequence of sin and death. We also fear things like storms and lightning, things that we can't control and perhaps don't fully understand. We have the fear of death within us. And although we were designed to live in a sunny place and be exposed to sun essentially constantly, we're now afraid of the sun. We actually are so afraid of the sun that we live in boxes. We make ourselves boxes with artificial lights in them. Now, we dress up the boxes, that's to be sure, and they look nice on the outside. But essentially, we live in a man-made box with artificial light when we were originally designed to live outside under natural light conditions, eating naturally produced food that would be self-renewing. And so we live in an artificial world. And so much so that our fair skin, for most of us in North America who are fair skinned, and maybe Northern Europe, are actually afraid of the sun. We hide from the sun in order to prevent skin cancer. We also are a people that are constantly at war. We kill and we murder and we riot. How can we say people are inherently good when the history of humanity is one of a constant war against other people? And of course, we all die. And we said before that perhaps death is an invader into the reality of the world. We suffer. We live about 120 years. We have to go through the process of dying and death, and no one can change that. You will die and I will die. We suffer in sorrow for the ones that we've lost. If you've ever seen someone die, it's a horrible process. Watching a loved one die, go through something that you can't change, and that their loss is tremendously felt through the rest of your life. But that death and that anger against God is our fault for the sin that we have. and the fact that we live in a world that we are afraid of, the sun and uncontrollable weather, and a world that no longer feeds us as it once did. That's our fault because of sin. It's not a natural thing. So how do I see the world? I see the world from a Christian perspective as broken. So where do we go next? Next we go to the section called Seeing the Arrow in Science. The second to the last section, where I'll talk with you about, as I do my work and I read the scientific literature, how do I interpret from a Christian perspective some of the interesting anecdotes that occur in the literature that may mean one thing to one scientist and may mean something different to me because I see the arrow. We'll talk next about seeing the arrow.